Quick bit from me, and then I will hand over to Josh. Thank you everyone for coming. We're up to about 40 people, so that's pretty good so far, and I expect more will drop in as we go. As usual, if you have questions, comments, feedback, or discussion, feel free to email me. A quick overview of our community guidelines and code of conduct. Generally, just be respectful to each other. If you disagree with anything, feel free to disagree, but do so respectfully. Our remaining community schedule for 2024 is starting to wrap up. We've had a couple of new events put in there since our last community call. So next week, I think, if I get my dates right, we will be hosting a joint discussion with Arcadia around gauging the impact of science. That was with me, Robert, and Prachi. There's a registration link in these slides. And I will also drop the registration link into the chat a little bit later. We've got a couple more lunch and learns coming up and some community calls. And then in November, we will be hosting Ashley Farley from the Gates Foundation to discuss the new policy that will be going into place in January next year. So that's a good opportunity for you to come along with any questions you have about that. And there will be a registration link. If you're wanting to catch up on any community calls we've done or the lunch and learns in the past, they're all on our YouTube. And as always, please do leave feedback. Again, I'll drop this link into the chat later on because it is very, very helpful and helps me shape what we're going to offer up for next year. So today I'm going to hand over to Josh very soon. I'm very excited about this talk. So Josh will talk for about 25, 30 minutes. We've then got time for Q&A before we move on to the interactive whiteboard activity that I'm sure many of you are starting to get used to now. And this is what it will look like this time. Whilst we do that activity, we can also continue the Q&A session. And with that, I will hand over to you, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining, especially on the sunny days and people in their evenings, I suppose, or all around the world. So my name is Josh. I am the co-founder of Scite. I'm a cell biologist by training. I'm going to try and get Zoom out of the way so I can share my screen some more. And I'm going to talk about the use of AI in publishing and preprints. Give me 1 second. Okay, fantastic. So yes, thanks everyone. My contact info is here. As mentioned, I did a PhD in cell biology. I've gone on this journey of, really kind of looking at publications because I was always interested in, I guess, how science is done. And I mean, how science is done from how is it published, how is it funded, etc. And so I think these processes around research are part of research itself, right? We often think sometimes they're peripheral, but getting that grant, publishing are all integral parts of research. And so I think there's a variety of different groups, tool builders, publishers, everyone kind of in the ecosystem, librarians, students, working to improve, research and how we communicate that, how we discover that, and how we understand that. And so today, I'll talk a little bit about AI, but I wanted to kind of just ground us in like, where are we? What do we think of when we think of research? Generally, we think of research papers, right? If you come to a bioRxiv or a publisher's site, what are you first looking for? I would say in most cases, you're probably looking for the PDF button, right? And you can see here, even on bioRxiv, the largest call to action is download PDF. And so researchers, it's a natural thing to come to articles and quickly get the PDF, download it, maybe print it up.
Something I can do while I make food.
And move on. And so here is, another case from a journal. Again, when you come to this, maybe you're reading the abstract, kind of scanning it, but I would say that most researchers are reading PDFs, right? They're looking for that PDF, so much so that, researchers have even created extensions that are just give me the effing PDF, right? And so here's, a variety of different complaints and suggestions talking about, how researchers just quickly want the PDF. They don't want multiple clicks. They don't want enriched PDFs. They don't want ePDFs. They don't want any of these things. And I think this is important to emphasize because this is what we kind of think of when we think of research, right? This nice PDF when we show on slides, and even with my own research, you show that nice typeset PDF. right? You're generally not showing the web page, the HTML. And that's, important here, as I'll discuss, because the research that we communicate and how that interacts with PDF, depends upon the format, right? And so this is, again, taking that PDF once you get it, what it looks like. And in general, research articles are all going to kind of look like this, right? They have an abstract, they have the title, they have the authors. Some are 2 columns, some are single column. There's thousands of different reference styles, but they're more or less look the same. And so most research is still in the form of PDFs, right? And so on the right side is a 2016 research article that is looking at the detection of gravitational waves. And on the left side is a 1916 research article, a research paper from Einstein predicting it, right? And so this is 100 years apart, and they largely look the same, right? And I think there's some good things about that. It's good that we resist some of this. This has helped us, look at this. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, we are pretty resistant to a lot of different enhancements, AI enhancements, like different things that happen to scientific communication, right? And to give you, an example of how much research is still in PDFs, I just pulled the numbers from Scite, and we have analyzed, 70 million PDFs and 30 million XML documents, so JATS XML. And, pre-2000, almost everything's in PDF. Some publishers go back and do a lot more work and invest the time and energy, but most research content is still in PDFs. And PDFs are not great for text mining. They're not great for a lot of different things. They are great for printing. They look nice on slides, and then you can certainly mark them up as you, drink a coffee outside. And I think a lot of us as researchers, despite having these advances in how we could communicate, prefer, the PDF still. And so how does OA and preprinting relate to AI, right? Well, how do we think about these things of open access and preprinting? Again, like kind of what do you think about? You probably think about, okay, is that open? That means people can read it. Preprinting, that means it's open and fast, right, and transparent. And again, just to remind us, like, where do these things come from? What are the definitions of open access? And so, very early on, I pulled this quote from the Budapest Open Access Initiative, and they're defining it as, by open access to this literature, we mean its free availability on the public internet, permitting any users to read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, or link to the full text of these articles. And I would say we as humans see that as like, yes, that's what we care about when we care about open access. Can I read it? Can others read it? Is it free to humans that are paying these taxes? But there's an excerpt that I left off here intentionally, which is, and that we can crawl them for indexing and that we can pass them to data as software. And so, for a long time, 20 plus years now, we've recognized that research papers are not just PDFs, but they are data, right? They are data that can and should be utilized by a variety of different software applications. And maybe not every single software application is going to be good, but, as we increasingly have more and more content, it'll be necessary to index, to look at research articles in different ways, to summarize them, to discover them, et cetera. And a lot of that means interacting with the research articles with the machine, whatever that machine is, whether it's a large language model, a deep learning model, or an Elasticsearch cluster. And so similarly, bioRxiv has also kind of recognized this. Again, maybe most of us are not using this in any way, and we're just happy to have access to preprints and we can quickly look at it. bioRxiv has an entire page that looks at, machine access and text and data mining resources. And the second sentence, they say, bioRxiv provides free and unrestricted access to all articles posted on the server. And they say, we believe this should apply not only to human readers, but also to machine analysis of the content. And so again, underpinning, I would say, preprinting and open access is this idea that articles are not just for humans, but they're for the machines, right? And therefore, these other sometimes transformative or sometimes, sophisticated analyses that are being run on them. I would also highlight that, preprints are where most AI research is published, right? And so if you are reading about, these new advances in different large language models, et cetera, you're likely reading about, them from arXiv, right? arXiv, bioRxiv, things like this. And so at the core of like utilizing research for AI and kind of looking at research articles beyond just PDFs, I would say it is open access and preprints, right? And that's exceedingly important here, because that's allowed us to get started, I think it's consequential for like, what is the future as open access becomes, more prominent and machines become more accessible? How does that evolve things? And so that's a little bit, again, to kind of just ground us on saying, research is not just a PDF. It is a vast network of data, of assertions, of evidence, statistics, et cetera, that can be utilized in many more ways than, just printing it out and reading it at a coffee shop. Although that is a very good use case that I personally love myself. And so what are the use cases for AI in publishing and preprints? And what are some future use cases that we might explore down the line? And so, as mentioned, I am a cell biologist by training. I started a company called Scite.ai. We started this back in 2018 before AI had so much attention. And this wasn't because, I wanted to be some techie or some startup person. It was really trying to improve processes that I saw that were inefficient in how we evaluate and discover research articles. And so AI was a tool to get there, right? And I've always been of the belief you don't do the experiment based on your techniques, but you do it based on the question and then figure out the techniques to kind of do that. And I think that is how I viewed AI, is that it can be very powerful. We shouldn't just do AI, or use AI for AI's sake, but depending upon what you can do, it can be used in very beneficial ways, which hopefully you'll see from Scite. It can also be used in ways that, maybe shouldn't be so used. And so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of like how we use machine learning at Scite, and then I'll talk a little bit about, kind of the stuff that we're doing with large language models. And so here is the main article coming out of my PhD. As mentioned, I was doing a lot of microscopy, something I don't do anymore nowadays and kind of miss. But when you look at this research article, again, maybe if you're wanting to read it, you're looking at the download button and moving that PDF and going on. But I would say you generally look at a few things, right? Where is it published? Who are the authors? What are their affiliations? And then some metrics. And so these views and metrics, right? This is using like machine intelligence, if you will, or software, the internet to track these things, right? And so if you click through to the number of citations, historically, and still in many cases today, you'll come to a traditional citation index, Scopus, a Web of Science. What these tools show is a list of citing documents. To see what these 66 documents have said about my work would be a lot of time and energy and probably money, unless you are at a university, to see how has it discussed my work, right? Do some, has anyone built on top of my work? Has anyone refuted it? How do they cite it? Do they cite it in the methods section? Do they cite it in the introduction section? All that stuff is there if you're willing to open the full text. But it's just totally impractical to expect someone to open 66 different documents to see what they've said about one article, right? And if you're talking about, looking at dozens of articles, you're talking about hundreds, thousands of different citations. And so we utilize citations in a very superficial way, right? A high number is good, a low number is not so good. Here's the impact factor, here's the H index. These are proxies. And I think there's a lot more that we could do, right? And, I personally didn't love citations, which is funny because I've thought about them and worked on them for so long now. But I think that's maybe because of how they've been used, right? Like, okay, yes, you have a highly cited paper, but is it right? Has anyone built on top of it? And I think, what we're trying to do as Scite is to bring more context and nuance. And to achieve that, we have utilized a lot of machine learning, or AI, if you want to use this as an umbrella, to get there. Right? And so here is my article through the lens of Scite. We do show a list of citing articles. We show the same metadata as the version of record. But the key thing that is really different from us is that we go into the full text of the scholarly document, identify using machine learning, as I'll discuss in a little bit, the in-text citation, and then extract out this context. Right? And so here is an article that was published 3 years after mine. It says, in agreement with previous work, cites Nicholson et al. The trisoma clone showed similar aberrations, albeit to a lesser extent. We started Scite really in response to growing concerns around reproducibility. And so we have a deep learning model that looks at this and is analyzing the text to look at, is there supporting or contrasting evidence? And so here, we're going from kind of a flat list of citations where it's just titles, we're treating them all the same, to a much more rich contextual view where we show the actual in-text citation or citations, because sometimes you can make multiple in-text citations, and then we help you filter it, right? A results section versus an introduction section citation are quite different generally. There's no sophisticated deep learning, but you do need to identify where you get it from, right? You do need to identify that this is actually an in-text citation and it's not some math or something else, right? And so there's some technical challenges here. And I would say, yeah, maybe questions at the end would be good, although I'm open to kind of both. And so the first step, and this relates a little bit to what I was saying, is we were able to get started on Scite because open access had made enough progress where we didn't have to worry about access as the first step. We had to worry about, can we technically build what we want to build, right? Can we build out these citation contexts? Can we analyze them, etc.? And so we started Scite based purely off PLOS articles. PLOS makes it, you can go to their website, you can download all of PLOS. If anything, it's too easy. I tried to do it and I started downloading all these gigs onto my browser and I said, no, stop. And so, that was a powerful part of getting started here, is because we could download OA content very easily that was very nicely structured as well to build out this proof of concept. Since then, we've partnered with publishers. This is not an exhaustive list. It's also out of date, but it's a pretty graph. And it shows, that we're now working directly with publishers to get access to content that's otherwise not open access, right? And again, I think that partnership and cooperation with publishers is how we're building these next generation of citation with publishers, right? It's not just Scite doing it. It really takes this cooperation with publishers. And so why were we called Scite.ai? And what is kind of the machine learning to get that excerpt? Well, here is, again, a PDF. And remember, we've looked at 70 million of these PDFs. Sometimes they look like this. Sometimes they are OCR versions of Royal Society documents that are, 200 years old. And so again, that's kind of nice that they look the same for such a long time. We've benefited from that, although, again, there's like some limitations there as well. And so we have to go in and utilize machine learning to identify that this is a citation, match Tang et al. 2011 to the correct Tang et al. In the reference section, take that string of information, and then match that against metadata from Crossref or DataCite. And so we're building out the citation graph from the full text of scholarly documents. We then have a deep learning model that looks at this text and classifies it as presenting supporting or contrasting evidence to the cited claim. The way that we developed that was, as humans, to say, okay, we think we can read this and annotate this, and we want to train a system to do this so that we can do it at scale. And so we annotated roughly 40,000 different citation statements where we only looked at the context. We didn't look at any metadata, and where at least two different, members of the team, researchers, would say, okay, it looks like they are citing this paper and they're citing it because they have supporting evidence or analyses, or they're competing evidence or analyses to the claim. And again, utilizing these tools was necessary because we're now at like 1.3 billion citation statements, right? It's just too much for humans. And there has been attempts by various groups to say, we're not going to use machines. We're going to rely upon readers, right, to annotate these things. And that's been, piloted at various journals, discussed, but never takes off because, again, it's too high of an activation energy, right? People don't have the time to go in and annotate every single reference. And so machines here, I would say, have been a big benefit, right? It's brought a lot more context to us. And I think that's, interplayed with how we look at documents, that open access, preprints are part of Scite as well. And I would say this is, kind of been our core focus for the first 5 years of the company, right? And we're still in kind of, year 5. And so here is, my PDF, right? And so here's a PDF describing how we built Scite, right? It talks about the deep learning models we use, the precision, the recall, what other people have done historically. And you can go to Scite and see exactly how this has been cited as well by others, right? And so this is our kind of AI application. And I suspect, most people, when they think about AI, are not thinking about this kind of application. They're thinking about large language models. But I think it's important to emphasize that there's a whole spectrum, right? There's, maybe there's more vanilla type of like machine learning versus large language models. But these tools, whether it's a deep learning model that we use, they're all becoming pretty easy to use off the shelf, right? You can go to any website, type in questions, get answers. You can fork a lot of these different models and use them for a variety of different purposes. And so the machines are increasing, in use case, in their availability, in their power. And the amount of volume of literature is increasing, also OA literature. And I think that becomes an interesting kind of nexus where how do we start to reconcile these things? How do we start to use them? Are we banning AI entirely in this, right? I think that's been our initial kind of gut response is no AI in these in peer review, no AI in submissions. You do a checkbox. And of course, checkbox is hardly really stopping this, as I'll show, because it is being used, right? And I think we have to acknowledge the fact that these large language models, AI in general, is here to stay. And so how do we, make sure that we're not, trying to, I would say, block everything, but that we can make sure we're using it in a responsible way, understand the limitations, so that we can harness the benefit of these powerful machines and limit the challenges, right? And there are certainly challenges and issues here. And so here is Scite, again, this like machines eating up the literature and now providing nuance to help readers better understand and discover, how preprints have been cited. And so we're live on arXiv, we're live on Wiley, going beyond just a number and a simple list, right? And I think that is, a use case that's worth highlighting where AI has been, I would say, beneficial, and is now being adopted by major publishers in a variety of different ways here. It's also interesting, as I'll show, there's this big AI declaration in PNAS that was published yesterday, and then alongside it is the little Scite, AI badge, right? And so AI is here. It's already part of research communication in many ways, and it's becoming even more so just because the use cases or the ease of use is becoming a lot easier. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, this is not like the first time anyone's kind of thought of this, right? We thought we were clever. We've come up with new types of citations. You can see if they're supporting, et cetera. But here's a quote from 1964 from Eugene Garfield. Eugene Garfield created the first science citation index, which was hugely influential in creating, how Google ranks things. And in this, paper, he talks about, can citation indexing be automated, right? And so even then, back then, he's talking about machines, because going from this highly manual, laborious process of like building out a citation index with actual physical books to something more automated, he was thinking about how can we improve this. And so in this, he talks about building out a citation graph. He then also talks about citation markers, right? And he says these markers would appear in the published citation index along the usual citation. And he gives an example such as a critique citation, or a Mr. X is wrong, or a data spurious citation. And very presciently, right, 1964, he says the intelligent machine would examine a new document and generate a critical statement such as rather poor paper. And so here we kind of are today. People are doing this. It's imperfect in many ways. Maybe it's horrible in many ways. Maybe it's great. But we're at this stage where the machines are analyzing, utilizing research documents to look at citations, to look at other aspects, summarizations of it, et cetera. And again, I think, I don't have like a clear answer of is it right or wrong, but I just want to discuss a lot of different use cases and then, ultimately have a discussion with you all, and then, this exercise afterwards. And so our focus has been on, processing and working with publishers to build these next generation citation index, and then here comes large language models, right? And so this is, I think, what has kind of taken the world by storm, like LLMs, like ChatGPT, and all the other, various implementations of them. If you ask ChatGPT for references or you ask it a research question, it gives you a highly authoritative and confident answer that can be wildly wrong, right? And so, there's a tweet from one researcher asking about, a bibliography publication bias. It does give references. JAMA is a real journal, right? It has a DOI. Some of these are likely real researchers, but it's kind of this Frankenstein of all these different pieces. It doesn't actually exist, right? So you can't actually read these articles, right? And so that's problematic. And I think, this problem of LLMs and them looking really authoritative but being wildly wrong, is one reason why we start to kind of like distrust them. And I think, we have good reason for that, but that doesn't mean that there's a block everything kind of, mentality here. And so, here are some recent content. We're talking about looking at the words like AI is infiltrating research, right? How do we protect the integrity of research, right, against these machines that are going to take over this, right? And so these are pretty recent, right? One is literally May 21st, talking about, let's look at, how this impacts how we communicate to researchers, to policy, trust in the public, et cetera. And so research is, I would say, one of the most important like human endeavors. And so rightfully so, we should be thinking about, maintaining the integrity of research. And again, I think AI can be a partner here. It can also be something that challenges us. And so if you look at these, and you look at, again, more language here like infiltrating or contamination, you start to see some kind of signals that more and more researchers are using AI. And there's, other preprints here also documenting the use of AI in peer reviews, right? And so it's happening. People, want to get outside to the nice weather. And so maybe instead of spending 4 hours meticulously peer reviewing the document, they put it into a machine and ask some questions and build on top of that. And I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying, that is happening, and it's something that we're going to have to kind of, start to address. With that said, here's a surprising finding from that preprint, right? They're trying to look at these markers that will say, okay, this is likely to be AI written or not. Also, that is very imperfect, and so there are limitations there. And then they want to see, like, does that affect kind of the quality, right? And they use citation counts, pure citation counts, as a proxy of this. And basically what they saw is that the more, someone uses ChatGPT or LLMs, like they're being more highly cited, right? And that's not like the full story, but it's an interesting thread that I think is going to start to emerge, which is like, how does like, LLMs or ChatGPT enhance or harm, the research processes, and where can we use it in these different cases? In this case, this one stuck out to me, and it is really like, okay, these challenges make it more difficult. These challenges being like AI and generative AI in particular. How do we confirm the veracity of generated content reviews and analysis? Well, that's always been a challenge, even for humans, right? How do we confirm the veracity of human, content, right? Is it enough to have citations to say this person's a researcher at Harvard and so it must be right? I would say no, right? And so I think, as we discuss here and likely in next week's chat, looking at this has kind of been a long process, right? And it will continually be a process of how do we evaluate research, make sure we trust it, how do we build on top of it, et cetera. And so in many cases, I think, citations here can play a crucial part, right? And citations, I gave a talk on this recently, have played a pretty crucial part in a lot of like information dissemination, whether that's, ranking web pages, right, in the early days of the web, to, providing citations for Wikipedia. And so here, I think, is a similar use case where citations have a strong role, and I mean scholarly citations as well as other, citations for, kind of grounding and controlling these beasts of large language models, if you will. And so we had spent 5 years building out these next generation citations to help you better discover, understand, evaluate research. In come these LLMs. And what we did was to say, hey, we know it's here, right? People are going to use it. How can we minimize like those hallucinations? How can we take that flexibility, that ease of use, so that someone can ask a question without maybe knowing how to do a Boolean search and get, a response from the literature that they can trust, right? And I would say that, most people don't do that, right? If you have a question around like a medical question, you're going to Google, maybe you're reading a blog post, maybe it's Medscape, maybe it's right. Again, it's hard to trust. And so research here, again, I think serves a very important point. And so this is what, Scite Assistant looks like. It utilizes LLMs in the background. But what is different here is that we're restricting this only to the citation statements and abstracts that we have, allowing you to provide real references, which you can hover over and then see, okay, here's what the machine says, here's what the human says. Is that enough? So, again, looking at this context, not just saying this is the article, trust it, but looking at the exact context to like validate and trust that, and going even deeper than that, right? Okay, we found an article that says that. Does that mean it's right? Well, you can now see how that article has been cited itself. Has it been supported? Has it been challenged? And so this opens up a whole host of questions. Should this be allowed? Should students be able to use this? Can they write essays? What does this mean for everything? What does it mean for education? And again, I don't think we have all the answers here. I think we're working with a variety of different librarians. We're constantly, talking to researchers, giving talks like this to have feedback and follow up. But I think this is, again, kind of a use case that's trying to minimize the most harmful aspects of LLMs in the research process and maximize, kind of the best parts of it. Right. And so combining this Venn diagram of like research articles and LLMs into a place where you can ask these questions and get a lot of trust. And so, this is kind of just a talk about like the last 5 years, and even the last 5 days, 5 months, everything is rapidly increasing, right? And so we're going to continue to see this where it's not just AI responses in text. You're seeing generative AI in, images. This has a lot of implications around, potentially fabricating results, right? Forget like these sloppy cut and paste Photoshop jobs. Now you can ask a machine, a generative AI, say, give me a Western blot that shows this, right? And these are going to be increasingly something that we should watch out that we don't want to contaminate. And again, maybe there's this arms race where like the machines detect the machines. I think this is something that we as a community, as researchers, as technologists, as librarians, as publishers, etc., need to think about and to cooperate on, so that we can go back to that PNAS article and make sure that we are, ensuring the trust and veracity of research, so that we get kind of that stuff that will stand the test of time, whether that's the prediction of gravitational waves or the detection of them. And so with that, I will conclude and say thank you. There's my email. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or if you want to chat, more in depth about something, I'd be happy to do that. And I look forward to the questions and the whiteboard exercise as well.
That we really hope works. Thank you, Josh. So I'm going to follow up with a question, seeing as you were just talking about trust, and we did chat about this before everyone else joined. How do you see this fitting in with researcher assessment moving forward? I'm imagining, so there's a slide whenever Richard Sever gives a talk about PhD CVs 2.0, where he's got, you've got your publications, and then you've got your preprint reviews, and you've got your preprint news and views. Do you see this as being something that could fit into those places?
Yeah. So I think, again, like, providing more context and nuance beyond just a list or like numbers, I think will help, right? And maybe that's like you writing that, right? So there's these narrative CVs that people have discussed, and then there's also like the more traditional CVs. I think there's analyses that, we've done kind of as proof of principle to say, forget just supporting and contrasting, like what are the common phrases that people use about your research, right? And that's takes, some technology to do that. And so I could see that happening. We have metrics. Some of those are kind of funny, where if you sign up, you can claim your papers. And we have like a Spotify Wrapped type thing. And so it's analyzing, say, okay, here's the topics that you might talk about at dinner parties, right? And most researchers are like, oh, right, I'm boring at dinner parties. We're looking at like, as Nobel laureates cited you, but we also do look at other things like, how do you cite others and how are you cited? And one anecdote, that I can share from Scite is, people are kind of scared to have contrasting citations. They don't want, that means my work, maybe someone's challenging this, what is that? And they don't like it. But what I've really found is that, people that contrast their previous work, so self-citations that are classified as contrasting, I immediately trust them, right? They're not publishing trophies. They're not saying no one's ever challenging my work. They themselves are changing their mind. They're revisiting things, and they're discussing that openly. And so there's even kind of use cases like that I think we're just scratching the surface that could be part of like, evaluation at the researcher level, right? Are you critical at all? Do you ever challenge research? Do you ever challenge yourself? Or are you just like kind of hacking your way into highly selective journals and producing these trophies, right? And so I think there's, of course, this complex ecosystem, all these things. But I do think, there will be an evolution of CVs and how we evaluate researchers. And I do think AI will certainly play a part here. Yeah.
A question in the chat from Olia. Is the closed access literature basically a blind spot for you?
No, so as mentioned, we have spent significant amount of time partnering with publishers, right? And that's to get access to subscription-based content. And so, that's not easy. And so we've worked with publishers, and we sign these indexing agreements. And so most content in Scite actually is not away. Yeah.
Can I follow up on this question? Because it was my question.
Yep.
And thank you so much for nicely putting it in English terms. English is not my first language. So, but basically that means that you have an access to this. So your tool has an access to this publication, which is actually closed access, and you can index it, but you cannot, or can you provide eventually the pieces of text to your user? So basically
Yeah.
it means that through your tool, user can have an access to something which they didn't pay for. That does it, like,
They
do you
can
know
have
what I mean?
access, so they can have access to a snippet of it, right? And so we're not trying
A
to hurt.
snippet is a small part.
Yeah, so we will
I
show
see.
snippets from those articles as opposed to, the full article. And so it's generally 3 sentences. And so you might see those 3 sentences, and then if you want to read that article, you may not have access to it. Yeah.
I see. And then your users, I'm sorry, I have not really used your tool. So do you have to pay to use your tool?
You do. Yeah. And so there are
Okay.
certainly also limitations with what the publishers allow us to do, right?
I
So
see.
we can't analyze all these things and then kind of mass distribute that content, right? The publishers don't like that. So there are copyright and
Clearly.
but yeah, I'd say it's.
And so if, and you don't have to, of course, answer, maybe it's not like you want to disclose this, but do you pay something to publishers, or do you do they just
We do
support you
not,
for
right? And that was just because we started as a group of 4 researchers, right? We couldn't pay publishers even if we wanted to, right?
I
And
see.
so accessing research at the scale that we access would be tens of millions of dollars, right? In some countries,
Exactly. So I was like,
have paid that.
how well, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
That's fabulous that you managed to do this, and it's absolutely fantastic. And thank you so much for your work.
Thanks. Yeah. And so, I mean, I would
Yeah.
say to that end, we are working with publishers. We're not charging them for anything. And so we give to get, right? We give them data, we give them different services, we integrate into their products. There's even stuff that I personally
Clearly,
really want to explore, which is, okay, it's nice that we show this badge, which has 3 numbers. Maybe that's better than 1. But what if we showed some of that context directly on the version of record, right? And so we call this native citations or white labeling Scite. And I think that's something where you could go to, a publisher page and you see not just related articles that are 3 titles, but you see the context from other publisher ones because they have the copyright to do that. And so I think there's a lot more that we can do. You could also, we have this future idea. I mean, it's not even a future idea. It could be implemented now where it's, you read an article, we call it lighting up the article. You see DLD1, right? A cell line, you click on that, it shows you every citation context mentioning DLD1, right? And so you can have this idea where it's citations for specific, ontologies and things like that as well.
So Theodora, you can ask your question while I load the whiteboard.
Yeah, I also.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm someone who's followed Scite from your early days, and I like the idea, but most of the time when I look up an article, Scite has a couple of things that cite it, and they're neutral. They just cite it. And I just wondered if you have any idea what proportion of things have something that you could call either supportive or refuting it. And if there's going to be any, if you see the generative AI or other means of increasing the likelihood that what you see is not just, yeah, a load of articles cite this, but something more sort of informative.
Yeah, so that's a great observation, and there's a couple things to respond to, right? So you're absolutely correct, right? Most citations, if you're looking at supporting, contrasting, and mentioning, are mentioned, right? And this is about, I think, 94, 95%. And then supporting citations are about 5%. Contrasting citations are exceedingly rare, like 0.6%. And so important in that is how we define these, right? So it's not just positive or negative sentiment, and it's not enough to kind of like be negative, if you will. So we're not actually looking at negative citations, and sometimes that's confusing for users. But we're really looking at, is there, and can we tell that from that snippet, a claim that is being supported or challenged, and that there's evidence or analyses to back that up. So looking at that language. So there's a higher bar. I think if you did just look at like sentiment across these snippets, you would see a lot more granularity. But to me, like that's a bit intentional, where we don't necessarily just want to kind of collect opinions. We would really like to surface, supporting and contrasting evidence. And, people like generally are sometimes when they cite, like everything's novel, right? Everyone's publishing something novel. You're not rewarded for repeating necessarily. You're also not necessarily rewarded for calling people out explicitly. So I think a lot of times when there is disagreement in the literature, it's by avoiding citing it, right? And so we don't address that. I think that's certainly interesting to look at, where you could see like, here's like clear disagreement with these groups and these findings, and there's no citation amongst them at all. The other thing I can say is like, we only classify that text around that snippet, those 3 sentences. And so our lab strongly like refuted a paper that's published in Nature. Our numbers were just like wildly different. There was nothing personal about this, but we're like, okay, we want to correct the literature. And so we did. And, Scite had a hard time picking that up, because a lot of that kind of critical language was outside of the snippet. And so there's certainly limitations here, and I think that's one of them. The other thing I can say is like, we, break down citations, not just in those 3 types, but I think sections are different types as well, right? So results versus discussion section. And LLMs, make it a lot easier to classify. And so we haven't just done it because I think like already there's some confusion with our new thing. And I think you want to be careful of like going too deep and saying, this one's been cited, and there's 30 different citation types. But I certainly see it over time where we explore it, or someone else explores it. And we introduce kind of new types around that. And I do think LLMs will be interesting there. I don't think we're going to necessarily like look at like LLM detecting type citations, but that's not even something I've considered, so it could be interesting.
Heather, do you want to unmute?
I can also just read some of these and answer. Yeah, so are there plans to make Scite open source, especially since it relies on OA research? There's not any immediate plans. Like, we don't really have any kind of secret sauce in like the code. The big limitation that we have to protect is the publisher content, right? We signed a lot of different indexing agreements. The deep learning model, we describe exactly the deep learning model that we use, right? And so that is used. The code for processing PDF is open source. It's built by Grobid. We contribute back to that. And so a lot of Scite is open source, not all of it. And so you can certainly, go out there and build a prototype of Scite and build on top of it. There's just also certain like limitations that we protect. A is like a business, because we don't want like the Clarivates and the Elsevieres just ripping it off. But then B, like, there's copyright things there as well. And so we try to be as open as possible. With that said, we do have like open APIs. We do share data with researchers. And we've even discussed internally, like kind of making that more open, where it's just not making all the snippets open, because we can't do that even if we wanted, but the counts, right? And doing some data dump of this, right? Because I think there's a lot of value of using our data for bibliometrics. Next question. When you're saying that you use words and phrases that others use to describe your work, do you look at bias in the data, preference for English? We have not done that. I think it would be fascinating. So we're not like, I haven't done an analysis looking at, our men or women, more supported or more contrasted. But that data is available. And so if you want to do such a study, we'd be happy to make it available to you, right? And there could be, different biases that you can detect using Scite, looking at geographies and things like this. And so a lot of these become easier to answer because of our data. And so it's not something that we've been able to do, mostly because we've been such a tiny team, like, building the product. But I think it's fascinating to look at. Next one, do you need to currently have a Scite subscription? Yes, you do. And that was really just so, we could build a sustainable business. which we've done. And, we are part of Research Solutions now, which, means we merged the company, but we really did that to remain independent. And that might sound funny, selling a company to remain independent, but we didn't want to be gobbled up by a large publisher and built into one of these tools. And so, Research Solutions is an independent, company, relatively small, has many relationships with publishers, solves some of these access issues. And so, we're going to continue to build Scite, and it will remain independent of these large behemoths, so that people can use it. Can AI facilitate a more holistic review process in scholarly publishing, integrating quantitative analysis of research methodologies with traditional qualitative peer review? Yeah, I think so, right? And so I think, there's a variety of different use cases for AI. I think ultimately what we're going to need to do is to test these things, and I think that's always the case. I would love to see one journal, at least one journal, say, we're only going to do AI peer review, right? What does that mean for that? Is it detecting more things? Can the AI pick out major errors? And so there's a lot of opportunity for exploring these things and testing it. And I would say, even in developing search strategies, people often see, okay, AI bias is bad, but humans are biased as well, right? And so, developing some of these search strategies and having AI develop them, arguably could be less biased than you as an individual coming up with, keywords that you want to search. And so it's a, there's a lot of nuance here and complexity. But I do think we need to start to look at use cases where it's like, how can we use this, right? Not just like, let's be scared of it, but how can we use this to better help with discovery, with, understanding, with reviews, and then also with, equity and bias, right? And I think, as these tools become easier, there's a lot of opportunity. Sorry, I took up all the maybe time for this, but it's been fun to kind of see these different things going on.
People are working away. This forced interaction seems to be taking off, and people are understanding without me needing to explain it now, which is quite nice. So this is just a very simple question of what do you think the current and potential positive and negative uses of AI are in terms of preprints and publishing. I think we could probably go beyond that and say in academia more broadly. I put one in the middle around sort of screening and peer review. I'm wondering if anyone has anything else that could fit in that middle section where it could be good, it could be bad. So far, you seem to have gone either way. I have a question though while we're doing this. Is there anything that you're currently working on in relation to peer review or those kind of screening aspects with this kind of tool?
We're not. We have a reference check that was candidly really hard to integrate into publisher systems. There's only a couple of different submission systems, and how you integrate into them, costs money or is hard to do. And so you don't get a lot of opportunity because you have no control over that part, right? And so we have this reference check, and the aim of that was to look at references and to help, authors, editors, peer reviewers say reference 5 has been retracted. Are you aware of that? Or reference 5 has been challenged. Are you aware of that? And so we do that on preprints actually, and help authors, but it's a challenging space, mostly because you have to go to where the submissions are happening to, I think, have any kind of impact. And those tools, no offense to them, are a bit archaic and hard to integrate with. And even if you have an integration, your processing takes 30 seconds. Sometimes their processing takes a full day, right? And so those things matter, like the details of the execution on implementation really matter. But I think there's a lot of very interesting people working in this space, looking at, detecting paper mills, fraud. Some of that's, I think, just doing kind of, citation analyses in many cases. Some of it is trying to do these AI detection. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of interest there, but there's certainly a lot of challenges.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to the next question I had, which was, have you been approached by people who do all the sleuthing type activity to try and use this citation data to identify potentially problematic papers?
No, we haven't. And if someone wants to, we would be very interested in exploring that, because I think there's just so many studies that can be done off our data that have yet to be, right? This question around like, okay, supporting and contrasting, how does that look across, different fields, right? And so we've done some of this ourselves. Supporting citations are much more frequent in math and physics than they are in social sciences, right? And I think there's differences in its types across different disciplines. There's likely differences in geographies. And so that's why we make, this data is available as much as we can so that people can study these things and we can utilize that and better understand these processes, et cetera. But we just haven't done it. And we don't have much of the capacity to, right? We're still a pretty small team.
I would also argue, Katie, a lot of life sciences is not all that firm. We just pretend it is.
Yeah.
We
And
say
it's not
things
necessarily a
about-
bad thing either to have debate, right? Like, so, there's another paper that was measuring the disagreement in science, and they took a very different approach to like classifying disagreement than us, right? But they found the same thing, right, across different fields. And so it like paralleled it. And I thought that was really interesting to kind of look at. And so they were just doing like kind of keyword-based analysis, looking at when there's disagreement, and they analyzed content and found that, again, math has a lot more or a lot less disagreement than say social sciences and things like that. But disagreement can certainly be very healthy. So it's not just as simple as more contrasting is bad, right? That's not the case.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned being able to identify the difference between someone who's self-citing and disagreeing with themselves versus not. Is that data, I mean, you don't separate it out yet, but do you plan to separate that out when you look at this and display it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, it's there. You can see it, right? Like I can see it when I go to an individual article. We'll show a self-citation. We'll show it's contrasting. It's not something we show on like profile pages where you'd be like, hey, this person has 8 contrasting citations to themselves. We could. I think that's a good idea. We haven't touched our profile pages in a long time, mostly because, again, there's big challenges for such a small team, and some of the stuff just takes time. But I think it's personally would be fascinating. I think there's also other use cases we're exploring where, publication counts or citations are used in rankings, right? And I'm not saying rankings are great, but I also think like how we use a lot of these things could be improved. And so I think we need to cooperate in a lot of cases with various researchers, bibliometricians, product builders, whoever, to provide that data in a variety of different ways so that it can, improve or understand this.
So we've got a quick question from Natalie about what would you say the most suitable AI tool is to aid in the peer review process?
Yeah, I don't know, is the short answer. I don't think it's like candidly Scite, right? We don't pass full text of articles to LLMs. Other tools might do that. I think they might have some issues with copyright doing that. And so those ones are maybe better, but I don't think they're also very sustainable because they're passing content to LLMs that they shouldn't be. And so I think, maybe this is something that publishers also have an opportunity to develop, right? Publishers sit on mountains of like peer reviews. Most of them don't even know where it is, right? Like we have open peer reviews. There's, for every article, there's 2 peer reviews, let's say, maybe more. All that is being untouched, right? Again, most publishers have no idea even where it is, like on their servers. That could be interesting to explore, developing and training a model that is used, for peer review evaluation. I would personally think there's like a lot of benefit to that. Like you get structured peer review, you get it immediately versus waiting months. There's of course challenges and limitations, but if you make that open, you can address some of those things, you can look at that. So I think we just need to be testing these things. And I think there's opportunity for someone here to build some of that, right? And so I would love to see that. Again, we can only do so much kind of on our side, but yeah, I think there's certainly kind of some interesting things coming down the line in terms of peer review, also how we disseminate content, et cetera. And you can even see that on bioRxiv, right? There's AI summaries already happening, right? And that's launched to mixed reviews, I would say, but it's also just kind of V1. Not everything has to launch perfectly, right? You learn from that, you improve, and you iterate.
And that it brings us perfectly to time. Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you, Josh, for an excellent talk. And we will see you all next week, hopefully, for our joint event with Arcadia, where we're tackling very similar topics. Otherwise, we have a lunch and learn next month, which I've forgotten what it's about. What's it about? Oh, it's about writing an opinion piece and how to pitch an opinion piece, which will be interesting if you want to get more engaged with things. Please do leave feedback on these talks. Like I said, they're incredibly helpful for us planning next year. If you want to hear from anyone in particular, again, let me know and we can arrange to get them on board. Otherwise, have a great day, evening, night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.